Society to Seniors Footprints on Slave Lake. Could you please begin?
Okay, my name is Dennis Woodard. I was born in 1936 at Colgate, Saskatchewan. I was raised on a farm. It was a mixed farm. There were two families on the farm, so there was lots of people to do the work. Went to my elementary school, I think up to grade 9, at a one-room school at Lorndale. After that, we finished off at the school in Colgate, and just after we moved into Colgate to started going to school in Colgate, it became one of the first centralized school districts, which meant that all the outlying school districts were moved into one. So all the one-room schools until the new school was built were all lined up, and so they were used for a year. So it was like a one-room, each teacher had a one-room school. I finished off my high school there in the new school. I went to Teachers College in Moose Jaw in 1956-57 year. Then after that, I returned back to my hometown Colgate, and I taught there for the next 2 school years. At the end of the school year, June of 1959, I wanted to continue with my education, but I was 1.5% short to be able to go to University of Saskatchewan, so I enrolled in University in Grand Forks, North Dakota. I was going to take a phys ed degree, and but then I found out that I also before I could teach anything other than phys ed, I would have to spend an extra year taking education classes before I could teach back in Canada, or at least in Saskatchewan. So after I was there for a while and went to each class once, I realized the only thing new I was taking was a swimming course that I hadn't taken before. So I quit and went home. I didn't know what I was going to do, and I thought, well, I'll just stay home, play hockey, and help a friend feed his show cattle. But then I thought, no, this is pretty stupid because I've got a teaching certificate. I'm sitting around not using it. So I thought, we'll start looking. So I'd looked in the paper, and I noticed that they were advertising for teachers in Slave Lake and Canuso. So I phoned, and I said I would like to apply for the one in Canuso, and I was mentioned I was interested in phys ed. And they said, well, we need a phys ed teacher in Slave Lake. Would it make any difference could you go to Slave Lake instead of Canuso? And I said, well, no, it really doesn't matter to me. I didn't know one from the other. But in the meantime, I'd seen another one advertised in Saskatchewan, and I thought, okay, give me a few days to think about it. So I thought about it, and I thought, no, I've been here long enough. It's time to go somewhere else and see something else. So I phoned them back and said, I'll take the job in Slave Lake, but I can't come until after, I forget what the date was in November, because my sister was getting married. So they said, okay, we'll expect you on the date right after, I think it was November the 12th, because it was right after Remembrance Day. So up to Slave Lake I came, and when I got into town, I had a number to make contact to get the key for the school and find out a little bit. And I think it might have even been Antoinette Vance. It was the first one that I spoke to regarding the school. And at that time, they were building onto the original Slave Lake School. They had 6 rooms running from where the original library is now, which was the first gym. And they were building the 4 rooms at the end of the hallway. So there was no room in there. So my classroom was in the Swanson's Lumber Company cook shack down on the west side of town. And so my first impressions of Slave Lake weren't that favorable. I had to stay in the old hotel that night. I got up in the morning, the power was off, couldn't shave or anything, just get ready, head down and meet the troop at the one-room school at the cook shack down there. As it turned out, I had been I think the sixth person to work with that group of students that year. They had pretty well used to doing things their own way. So when I came, of course, they were quite intent on continuing with that. Um, I had to use some pretty unorthodox discipline techniques once in a while to bring them back in line and get them under control. But it eventually did happen. It took a few weeks, and we worked things out. One thing that was amused at was some of the boys were almost as big as I was, and they kept asking if I was very tough, and I said, I don't know. And they insinuating that if they ganged me, there wouldn't be much I could do about it. So one day I just said, okay, let's do it. I figured if I back into a corner, they can't get around you. They're going to do nothing. So I just put the challenge out and said, okay, come on, let's do it. Otherwise, I don't ever want to hear it again. So they looked at each other, nobody got up, and they never ever mentioned it again. It ended up being a very good year, and one of the things that I was quite pleased with was that one of the girls, who was one of the sort of the ringleaders to an extent, asked me to be the MC for her wedding when she got married in Edmonton a few years later. So a lot of these kids are still around, and we still see them and have quite a good relationship. So it worked out to be quite a good deal in the long run. The town at that time was very different from what it is now. Where you come in off the highway, but where the college is, there was Wishart cabins there that were like little motel units. Just north of the tracks on the east side of the street was Loza's store. There was a Halfway Esso there that was operated by Pete Gramiak. There was a Chinese cafe there. And then right up on the end of that block where Rexall Drugs is, where Charlie Schurter had his electrical shop. And then on heading east along the old highway by the railroad track, there was the hotel, and Vance had a store there. And then if we went farther north, or along Main Street, right just south of where the Legion Hall is, I think, is where the Anglican Church is, which is that same little church that they moved out to Diamond Willow. And then just beside that was the police barracks, which looked like an ordinary house. And then forget what else was right there, but those two were there. And then on the pardon me, farther up, the forestry compound was just across the road from where Speedy is now, where that little strip mall is. That was the forestry compound, and then across the road from that, running down to where the Vanderwell Place is, was the landing strip for the forestry, and then just on the north side of that intersection, August Hangartner had a mink ranch that ran down towards and took in, I think, a lot of the area where Schurter's school is. And then on the other side, there were three little farms heading north up along Main Street, were passed right through where the airport is, and up to Old Town. Zutzik Mortel had a small farm in there. Alfred Eben had a farm, and then there was the Lucan farm. And then besides that, just where you come in, well, this area of town was a pasture where Joe Kirkpatrick lived. And to get over here, the old road went through where that walking bridge is for the bear trails. And as we turned in that road, you went across that little bridge and then cut across over into this open area over here. And Henry Sinclair also lived right in that area, cutting across there. And then farther south, there was a little farm just where the walking trails come out, pull away from the creek and go along the berm. I think you can still see a few little pieces of farm machinery. that are still sitting there. And then, of course, there was Reddy Hall and Lizzie had their farm just where the Cornerstone is. And then out on the Bear Road, the Bears had a very pretty little area in there right on the Moody Creek. And then farther down the road was the Schaefer Farm, and of course it is still there. So the town actually is very quaint, it's very different. You know, it's absolutely not at all like it is today. The Swanson's Lumber Company had a big lumber mill in Plainer, just down on the west side of town, just on the south side of the tracks, which is all residential right now. The only medical personnel around was Laura Atru, who was a nurse, and she operated out of the house where Aaron Lehman presently lives. The second year that I came, or that I was here, we had a Dr. Warwick come in as principal. And he never did prove that he had any credentials. He said they were all lost, burnt or something on a boat on the way over. And but anyway, he was here for 1 year, and he was a very good organizer. He had house leagues going. He had drama and choir. Actually, in many ways, you'd have to say he was actually a fairly good principal. At that time, the gym was brand new, and I think it was the first year that it was in use. So I guess technically, I was the first phys ed teacher that we had in Slave Lake, and I did most of the coaching and ran all of the phys ed programs. On that first year, he did some of the coaching. But there's, I think, what's worth mentioning is the first basketball team, school basketball teams that Slave Lake had, and the boys, the ones that I coached, the ones that were on the team were Brian Warwick, Harry Bottle, Furman Larondale, Marvin Wallstrom, Billy Jackson, and Clyde Sinclair. And the girls' basketball team that year was coached by Dr. Warwick. It was Linda Sloan, Elizabeth Potskin, Marion Sinclair, Grace Martell, Dee Sloan, Angie Lucan, Marianne Jackson, and Anna Borzell. So those, to me, it's fairly significant, you know, that those were the first ones that were our first actual basketball teams from the Slave Lake area. The curling rink was down close to where it is now. It was a 3-sheet curling rink, natural ice, and most of the time the ice was not very good, and that was the case with most arenas around the area because they were all natural ice. We had this Jimmy Heisman lived down at Wagner overlooking the bay at 9 Mile Point, and he was always very involved with what was going on in the community, in the school, and he helped all the time with the curling. So him and I used to look after all of the junior curling. We had school bond spills and a lot of activities going on like that. The basketball, and the years after, when I was doing all of it, it was Harry Bartlett was reminding me one day when we were talking about taking kids home after practice. I had a little Volkswagen, and there was rumors that we had as many as 9 kids in that Volkswagen, driving them home to Widewater and areas like that after basketball practices. The baseball, the first year I played baseball was in the spring of 1960, And the ball diamond at that time was right down, I think, around where Wally's Wash World is right now. But a lot of the locals are still here. There was 3 Jacksons that were on the team. Well, it was Doug and Johnny and Ralph, Emil and Cliff Pearson. I think Sam Sinclair played. Neil Rowe was on the team. Big Dave Giroux was a very heavy hitter, was on the team. Later, just Johnny Coutrie came along and played a few years with us. And I think Joe Kirkpatrick and Sammy Sinclair are on the team as well. But we used to travel around to all the ball tournaments. We'd go to over towards the Athabasca area and to Jarvie. Then, of course, Widewater and Canuso and Foss, everywhere close that had tournaments. After I was here for 4 years, I thought, okay, maybe I'm getting into a little bit of a slump or need something different. So I applied and got a job teaching in Devon. And I thought maybe that would, being close to the city would mean something. And that summer, before I went there, while I was going to summer school in Saskatoon, I met Lorette, who has been teaching in Duck Lake, but lived north of Prince Albert. So for that next year, while I was teaching in Devon, we did a lot of commuting back and forth. And so it was a long distance relationship. But near the end, I decided that being close to the city did absolutely nothing for me. I missed the lake and everything up here. And earlier on, somebody had said, once you drink the Slave Lake water, you never leave. And I was starting to believe that. And so we got married in the summer of 1964. And they offered us both positions back here in Slave Lake. So we came back to Slave Lake, and that's just when the oil boom was taking over. And it was growing very quickly. There was street work that was being done, and every time the street work started, so did the rains. And the result was that when it was dry, the dust was about as deep as the mud was when it was wet. And the schools it was very crowded. They had started building that new wing onto Wallstrom School, the one around along the south side. And but when we first started, I was doing phys ed in the gym, and Lorette was teaching on the stage with just a curtain as a sound barrier. So it wasn't always the most ideal situation. Later, they bought in 2 one-room classrooms, trailers actually, for the grade 2. And Lorette and this Valley Beauregard were the ones that got those, so at least they had a place where they could live. And those 2 trailers were just west of where the Catholic Church is, in that other block over there, close to where Gary Chenard lives right now. When we came, it took until November before our apartment was ready, because it had been so wet and everything was behind schedule. So the first part, we lived at Beauvair's cabin out at the lake. And then in early November, we got to move into the apartment, which was above True Value, right downtown. And so we were there for the 1 year, and one of our other friends that moved in that same time had just got married that year too, and we became close friends. And our entertainment every night used to be, they'd come down when the bar closed at 11 o'clock. They would come down, we'd shut the lights off, and and watch the bar empty across the street. And at that time, the Royal Bank wasn't there, and that area was a triangular parking lot. So there was always cars and everything parked, so people would be in there, and so it was always very entertaining, to watch that type of a thing. the schools, as I said, were often very crowded, and well, we were always waiting for another one, to be built. The second year after we were married, we spent 1 year in the apartment, and then we bought a house, which was located right where Remax is now, and so we lived in there for quite a few years, 7 years or so, and then during that time, the town was changing from a village to a town, and they were going from 6 councillors to, or from 3 councillors to 6. And Leo Bovair talked me into letting my name run for council. And I thought, oh, well, I'll let it go. Maybe at that time, you got in for 1, 2, or 3 years, I think, depending on the number of votes you got. And it ended up, I got the most votes of everybody. So I was supposed to take the position of deputy mayor, but I had no experience. So I said, no way, I wouldn't touch it. So Stan Pollard had experience, so he took the position of deputy mayor. I was proud to be on the first town council, but I did not like council work. It just was not for me at all. And I didn't finish the 3 years because I had indicated that I would be interested in administration position, somewhere along the line. And so they had something come open in McLennan and said, would you like to go up there to McLennan? So I said, sure. So we went to McLennan before the 3 years were up, and I got out of it. And we spent 1 year in McLennan. That was the 1960, 68, 69 year. And then after that, I was eligible for sabbatical leave because I'd been here for 10 years. So I went back to the U of A and continued. I took 1 more year of education. Then we came back to Slave Lake. There was other positions. I could have gone back to McLennan again. And I just said I didn't want to. I just wanted to be in Slave Lake and no place else. So then we came back. We was teaching back into our house. I was teaching here again, and in 1972, in Canuso, they had a situation where they relieved the principal of his duties around Christmas time. And so they asked me if I would go down and take over until they got things straightened out there. They said it could be a little while, it could be until the end of the year. They really didn't know. So I agreed to go down and take over there. So I went right after, started after Christmas. And when I got there, well, the principal was still in the school. He was teaching. And so some of the students were supporting him and some weren't. It was actually more like a community fight, using the school as a battleground. So the first day I went in, the bell rang. There was a bunch of students went out into the hallways and sat down for a protest. And so then we had to deal with that, sort of keep the lid on. It worked out. It was not a problem for me because they had no animosity towards me because I had nothing to do with it. But it was a very tense time, to be sure. But anyway, in the end, after a while, they finally said, okay, no more sit-ins. Either the kids went back to class or they were out. So they went back to class. And then ended up, everything went very well. And at the end of the year, I was offered the option to stay there and continue as the principal in Canuso School. And I said, no, I didn't want to do it. I only wanted to be in Slave Lake. And at that time, they had just finished building the high school. And Walter Dernan, for half of the year, was principal of both schools. And so said, if he takes the high school, I'll apply for a Wallstrom school. But he, if otherwise, I'll just give me a job teaching back at Wallstrom. So my luck was that he decided to take the high school, so then I was given the principalship at Wallstrom School. And that was mine for the next 20 years of my career. I was principal at Wallstrom School. And that of course, was one of the highlights, I guess. It was the only thing I wanted, and I finally had it, and it worked out so well. But one other thing that maybe to mention, that when I was in McLennan that year, we organized an extended field trip, and I think it was the first extended field trip that anyone ever took in the school division. And we went to we included the coal mining at Wadman. We went to Drumheller. We came here. We had the forestry put on a bombing display with their water bombers, and it was a very good field trip. After we came back here and took over, we had an annual grade 7 field trip, and sometimes we'd take about 4 buses because we'd have up to 4 grade 7 classes most of the time. So every year while they were at Wallstrom School, we went to Drumheller, and we would stay in the residence in Calgary. We'd take in Heritage Park, and we would go to Banff and a few other things around. So those were the extended field trips. That sort of where they grew from. Now, of course, they're going to Europe and all over the place. But those are some of the things that actually happened that are quite rewarding when you think back at them. In 1976, we decided to move out to the acreage. The house we were living in right downtown was, we needed to add some bedrooms. It was a commercial lot, and it just wasn't feasible to do anything really with it in those situations. So we started looking elsewhere, and we found a place in Wagner. And so we moved out there in 1976. By this time, we had all 3 boys. The youngest one was 3 years old, I think, at the time. And so it was actually a good time to move, and we ended up with horses. We raised horses, and we had a very good life living on the acreage out in Wagner, and then commuting all the time. The driving didn't bother us at all, but we did an awful lot of skidooing and quadding. And some of the fondest memories from my life in Slave Lake were naturally the contact with the parents and the students, the people that you run into, in this line of work. There's people that you're in contact with all the time, and there's so many of these people that do affect you an awful lot. They really enrich your life and make it something special. And some of the students that we still have contact with, it's really rewarding. Teaching with prior students is another thing that I always found very rewarding. One highlight I mentioned, there's a picture hanging on the wall there. It was a retirement picture from the Administration Association, the last principals meeting in High Prairie. The picture was presented to me by Alan Wallstrom and Harry Bartlett, and it was a picture taken by Charlie Ghostkeeper. And the significance is that Harry and Alan were president and secretary of the Administration Association. Charlie took the picture, and all 3 of them had been in one of my grade 8 classes in the same year. So I call it my coincidence picture. So it's a very, very special picture for me. The other things, old timers hockey has always been a highlight, a big thing for me. I couldn't wait to be 35 so that I could start playing with old timers. We played with rec, and then when we first old timers team was the Rusty Nuts. And we went to tournaments, always went to Jasper. We'd be in Cold Lake and Bonnyville. Westlock had tournaments. High Prairie, Donnelly and McLennan, we would always end up, at their tournaments. So we did a lot of traveling around. Senior baseball, we would go to a lot of the provincial tournaments, and we traveled around to senior tournaments around a lot of the country. The other things are the beach and camping trips. We spend so much time on the beach. We'd go to the beach a couple times a day during the summer, and we camped just about every weekend. Sometimes we pulled a tent trailer right down on the beach, and we were allowed to camp there. And then, of course, quad trips. Getting back in the bush. A bunch of us teachers and would get together every year. We would make a couple trips up to Grizzly Mountain, and of course, we do it in the wintertime with skidoos as well. So just the whole area around us and the use that we could make of it, are the things that make it also worthwhile. And I guess that's why they said you come to Slave Lake and you stay in Slave Lake, because it does have an awful lot to offer. And I'm just so thankful for all the opportunities that I've had, and and what it's done for me. Thank you.
On behalf of the Adult Education Society Committee, I would like to thank you very much for your participation and the telling of your story. Thank you.
You're welcome.